Very good evening. The police have launched an inquiry after Kathleen Warbutton, who had cancer and had suffered a stroke, died weighing just 3 stone. Weeks before, social services had been asked to look after her under the community care scheme. It seems that never happened.
It was in this house in the Southmead area of Bristol that Kathleen Warbutton was found dead on Christmas Day. She weighed 3 stone and a post-mortem showed she'd starved to death. But both the local health authority and social services knew about her plight. In November, a district nurse found her lying incontinent on a couch in her front room. She immediately alerted a GP, who called in social services under the community care scheme. 3 weeks later, in December, a social worker visited her. Social services say care was offered and declined. On Christmas Day, Kathleen Warbutton was found dead.
I believe anyway, and so do my family, if the social services would have would have acted more sooner, maybe she could still be alive today.
Southmead NHS Trust wouldn't give us an interview today, but they did release a statement saying this is a most distressing case and we will cooperate fully with all police inquiries.
And there are weather warnings this evening being...
Hello, good evening. The news for the West. A senior detective is leading an inquiry into the circumstances that led to a woman starving to death in her Bristol home. 54-year-old Kathleen Warbutton weighed just 3 stones when she was found. She had cancer and was also partly paralysed.
Kathleen Warbutton died in this top 4 flat in Southmead's Ullswater Road. A post-mortem showed she starved to death. She was found on Christmas Day morning, lying on the sofa in her lounge. Her husband, who'd cared for her for years, made the discovery. Her death, in apparently appalling conditions, shocked neighbours who described her as a very private person. It's known that a district nurse had visited Mrs. Warbutton in November and that her case had been referred to Avon Social Services. Southmead Health Services NHS Trust today confirmed that Mrs. Warbutton had been a patient. The Trust was taking this matter very seriously and will be holding an internal inquiry. Avon Social Services, also in a statement, said a visit was made to the family in December. The possibility of what services could be offered was discussed, but these were declined. Social Services said that any concerns arising from its and the police inquiries would be closely examined. All information will be passed to the coroner. Serious questions are now being asked by the police, Southmead health officials and Avon Social Services. They'll be trying to find out how Mrs. Kathleen Warbutton died without the authorities taking any action. Simon Whitby, HTV News, Southmead.
Britain's biggest...
From News West, good evening. An inquest has heard how a Bristol woman who starved to death in her own home died in appalling conditions. Kathleen Warbutton from Southmead was found dead on Christmas Day, weighing just under 4 stones. Her husband had told doctors he couldn't cope alone, and the inquest will examine the role of health workers and social services in the case.
Bristol Guildhall, not the usual place for an inquest, but the coroner's court in Bristol isn't big enough. Over the next few days, the court will hear evidence from 25 witnesses, including Mrs. Warbutton's doctors, social workers and her family. The first witness was Dr. Hugh White, the pathologist who carried out the post-mortem on Mrs. Warbutton. He said she died of pneumonia caused by starvation and neglect. He said she was in a dreadful condition when she died, severely emaciated, dirty and covered in sores. And he said once the inquest was over, there should be a full investigation into how she'd ended up that way. Professor Vince Marks, an expert in malnutrition, said there were 2 possible reasons for Mrs. Warbutton starving. She could have been anorexic, or her teeth were just so rotten it was too painful for her to eat. The court heard that Mrs. Warbutton had a history of medical problems. In the 1980s, she'd had a stroke and suffered from cancer, and for almost 30 years she'd been depressed and dependent on alcohol and tranquilizers. She was unable to go outside and relied on her husband Keith for almost everything. Just before her death, he told doctors he could no longer cope. The court heard that in the 2 months before her death, Mrs. Warbutton had been visited by doctors, district nurses and social workers, but she'd refused offers of help. And in the 3 weeks before she died on Christmas Day, she received no visits whatsoever. The case is expected to last several days. John Kay, BBC News West, Bristol Guildhall.
The voice of Rosemary West has been heard by the jury. A wonderful Christmas, one they won't forget.
Absolutely. An inquest jury heard today that a Bristol woman weighed less than 4 stones when she died at home in squalid conditions on Christmas Day last year. 54-year-old Kathleen Warbutton had refused all offers of help and literally wasted away.
This is Kathleen Warbutton in happier, healthier days. But she died aged 54 in appalling squalor, weighing just 3 stone 13 pounds. She was found dead in this first-floor flat in Ullswater Road in Southmead on Christmas morning last year. A post-mortem showed the cause of death as bronchial pneumonia brought on by starvation and neglect. Her body was simply too weak to fight infection. At the time, Southmead Health Service NHS Trust and Avon Social Services promised a full inquiry into the death of one of their patients, the results to be passed to the coroner. And today the inquest began, in a courtroom large enough to take the many witnesses who are being called to give evidence. They include GPs, district nurses, the police and members of Mrs. Warbutton's family. Police investigating the possibility of manslaughter initially questioned her husband, Keith. The inquest heard that he cared for his wife for nearly 20 years, as she lurched from one medical crisis to another. It was he who found her dead that Christmas Day. The inquest has heard that Kathleen Warbutton led a life of ill health, depression, with drug and alcohol dependency. She misused her medical treatment and often refused offers of help. And the fact that she died on Christmas Day, housebound and an invalid, was, in the words of a police report, the end of a sad and tragic life. Simon Whitby, HTV News, Bristol Coroner's Court.
The jury in the road
After death may have been made worse by the knowledge her husband was having an affair. An inquest heard today. Doctors and nurses warned that 54-year-old Kathleen Warbutton needed immediate attention, especially for the distress she felt, but she refused all help.
Husband Keith Warbutton turned up for the inquest today amid revelations that he was having an affair while his wife wasted to death at their family home in Bristol.
The inquest heard that Mr. Warbutton had started spending his evenings with his girlfriend. Mrs. Warbutton's former GP, Dr. Andrew Green, said the affair may have caused her psychological distress. He added that in the past, distress had made her resort to dependent, childlike behaviour.
The emaciated body of 54-year-old Kathleen Warbutton was found on Christmas morning at her first-floor flat in the Southmead area of the city. She weighed just 3 stone and 13 pounds. A post-mortem examination showed the cause of death as bronchial pneumonia brought on by starvation and neglect. The inquest also heard how a district nurse had expressed serious concern for Mrs. Warbutton's welfare after visiting her home. Sister Mary Finnerty told the jury that she had a long and in-depth discussion with the Dr. Carl Stainer about her concerns. She asked him to visit Mrs. Warbutton to see if more intense care was needed, but no visit was made. Social services were asked to assess Mrs. Warbutton's needs, but her case was put on hold when help was refused. Just weeks before Kathleen Warbutton died, she was seen by a locum doctor acting on behalf of her GP, Michael Dennison. He described the 54-year-old as severely emaciated and recommended immediate treatment. Nothing was done, and Kathleen Warbutton died 6 weeks later. The inquest continues. Derek Tedder, HTV News, Bristol.
The future of evidence at the inquest. Sister Mary Finnerty told the hearing that she visited Kathleen Warbutton twice before her death, but had stopped going to the house because Mrs. Warbutton seemed to be getting better.
Kathleen Warbutton was found dead in her Southmead flat on Christmas Day. A post-mortem examination revealed her death was caused by starvation and neglect. During the inquest, which began yesterday, the court has heard that Mrs. Warbutton had a history of medical problems and often refused offers of help. Today, Sister Mary Finnerty, a district nurse seen here in the red coat, told how she'd visited Mrs. Warbutton 7 weeks before her death. Sister Finnerty told the court that she'd been sent to treat Mrs. Warbutton for a bed sore. The patient had been lying on a settee for several months, unable or unwilling to move. But after 3 weeks of treatment, the sore seemed to have cleared up, and so nursing visits were stopped. Earlier, Sister Finnerty's colleague, Maureen Cottle, said that apart from the bed sore, Mrs. Warburton appeared to be in good spirits last November, and there was no sign that she was starving to death. The nurses described to the court how they'd tried to persuade Mrs. Warbutton to seek more professional care, but she'd refused their offers of daily nursing visits and Meals on Wheels and had told them her husband Keith was caring for her and she didn't want anybody else involved. Mr. Warbutton and representatives from Avon Social Services will give evidence when the inquest resumes on Thursday. John Kay, BBC News West, Bristol Guildhall.
Who'd given up caring for herself didn't need immediate medical attention. 3 weeks later, former model Kathleen Warbutton was dead, starved to death and weighing less than 4 stone. 2 doctors refused to give evidence at today's hearing, but her husband has been describing how she refused every offer of help.
On the 3rd day of the inquest, the jury at the Bristol Coroner's Court was told how 54-year-old Kathleen Warbutton had refused all offers of medical and social help. When visited by social worker Jenny Cooper several weeks before she was found dead, Mrs. Warbutton seemed to have given up.
After visiting Mrs. Warbutton, the social worker described her as a self-willed woman who appeared to be making her own decisions on how she was living. In a statement read out in court, she said that Mrs. Warbutton hadn't lost the appetite for living, but only for looking after herself.
Kathleen Warbutton's body was discovered last Christmas morning at her first-floor flat in the Southmead area of Bristol. She'd starved to death. Police officers visiting the flat said in court that she was found lying on a sofa wrapped in a heavily soiled quilt. She was so emaciated that initially one officer thought that she was around 80 years old. This afternoon, Kathleen Warbutton's husband Keith gave evidence. He started by handing the jury a photograph taken at their wedding. He told the court that even 20 years ago, Kathleen was thin. When accused of neglecting his wife, Mr. Warbutton replied, "You can't force someone to eat."
Kathleen Warbutton's GP, Dr. Michael Dennison, and the locum doctor who covered for Dr. Dennison both refused to give evidence. Under what's known as Rule 22, witnesses can legitimately refuse to give evidence in a coroner's court.
The inquest was adjourned until tomorrow, when it's expected the jury will deliver its
coroner's
verdict.
advice this afternoon by failing to reach a verdict. They'd been told that Kathleen Warbutton probably died from self-neglect. The coroner said that he'd settle for a majority verdict, but refused to allow them to consider unlawful killing.
Day 4 of this inquest, and Kathleen Warbutton's sisters expected the end of a 10-month investigation into her death. They wanted answers to how she came to starve at home in squalid conditions on Christmas Day last year, weighing only 3 stone 13 pounds, an invalid confined to the settee of this first-floor flat in Southmead. 2 doctors declined to give evidence, and the coroner said there was nothing to suggest gross neglect, thus ruling out a verdict of unlawful killing. He said Mrs. Warbutton had refused all help and that her death amounted to self-neglect. It's clear that the jury were deeply unhappy with the legal constraints of the coroner's court, explained to them as a fact-finding rather than a fault-finding tribunal. So, after 4 days of evidence, 4 hours of deliberation, they failed to reach any verdict and were discharged, and there'll now have to be another inquest. A harrowing prospect for Mrs. Warbutton's sisters, who nevertheless welcomed the jury's stand today.
We are very happy that the jury had the courage of their convictions, that under these circumstances, in this case, that there was not enough evidence for them to reach a verdict.
But Mrs. Warbutton's husband maintained that her death was probably due to self-neglect.
I would try to do things with her, for her. But no, she wouldn't let me. You know, sometimes she would, and sometimes she wouldn't. Wash her, she would let me. Then sometimes she wouldn't, and you can't force anyone.
So, a not unprecedented, but certainly a highly unusual decision by a coroner's jury. A second inquest into Kathleen Warbutton's death will be held soon. Simon Whitby, HTV News, Bristol Coroner's Court.
Well, joining us, it seems in this case that the jury wanted to blame
under 4 stone.
10 months after Kathleen Warbutton's death, her family hoped they'd finally get an answer today. Over the last 3 days, the inquest has heard evidence from doctors, nurses, social services and Mrs. Warbutton's husband. Now the jury had to decide what caused her death. Kathleen Warbutton's emaciated body was found at the family's Southmead flat on Christmas Day last year. She weighed less than 4 stone. The inquest heard that she'd spent the last 6 months of her life in appalling conditions, dirty, unable to walk and covered in sores. Today the jury had to decide whether Mrs. Warbutton's death was caused by self-neglect or by involuntary manslaughter. In other words, had she contributed to her own death, or were professional carers criminally responsible? After 3 hours, the coroner called the jury back and said he was going to offer them some advice. He said that as far as he could see it, there was only one possible verdict, that Mrs. Warbutton's death was caused by self-neglect. But after just another half hour, the jury returned and rejected that advice. They said then that they couldn't come up with a verdict. They were then discharged, and now there'll have to be another inquest. Mrs. Warbutton's husband, Keith, has sat through every moment of the inquest and said he was shattered that he'd have to go through it all over again. But he said he didn't blame anyone for Kathleen's death but herself, and he thought the jury would go along with that.
It is mostly self-neglect.
And
yeah, I would try to do things with her, for her, but no, she wouldn't let me.
Mrs. Warbutton's sisters, though, said they were pleased with today's verdict, or lack of one. They believe she died because others neglected her, not because she neglected herself.
Do you still believe that someone was culpable because of the way she died?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Very much so.
At the end of the day, it is an unsatisfactory verdict, and if it means that there will have to be a further inquest, it means that the family, friends, and everyone else will have to go through that same harrowing experience as they've gone through again. So it would be preferable to have a verdict, albeit an open verdict.
This inquest has taken months of preparation and cost thousands of pounds of public money. It's not known when the next inquest with a new jury will be held. John Kay, BBC News West.
The Bristol Petro...
It's the second inquest on 54-year-old Kathleen Warbutton, the jury at an earlier hearing having failed controversially to reach a verdict.
For the second time in 4 months, Kathleen Warbutton's husband going through the painful process of detailing her final bedridden days. What's it like having to go through all this again, sir?
Not very nice.
Absolutely terrible.
Glad when it's all over, can't be late.
He cared for her for years of failing health, both physical and mental. It was he who found her on Christmas morning 1994, lying in squalor on a sofa at their Southmead flat. She weighed just 3 stone 13 pounds and had died of bronchopneumonia. A psychiatrist, Professor Gerald Russell, told the jury that Mrs. Warbutton suffered from what's known as Diogenes syndrome, a severe form of self-neglect. And the jury was told that she refused repeated offers of medical help. 36 witnesses, among them police, social services, GPs and hospital staff, will be giving evidence during this second inquest. It's another hearing welcomed by the dead woman's family.
So here we are today for the second inquest, and hope that it will be a verdict this time. I feel very strongly it will be. Whether it'll be the verdict that we would like remains to be seen.
The inquest heard today that Kathleen Warbutton died as a result of her own gross self-neglect. What the jury will be trying to find out over the next 2 weeks is why she apparently lost the will to live, and they'll be re-examining the role of the medical and the welfare services in her desperate case. Simon Whitby, HTV News, Bristol Coroner's Court.
Armed police 4 stone when she died on Christmas Day in 1994 in conditions described as filthy and squalid. Last October, a jury at an earlier inquest failed to reach a verdict.
For the second time in 5 months, Keith Warbutton arrived at Bristol's Guildhall at the start of an inquest into his wife's death.
In court, the coroner, Mr. Brian Whitehouse, told the 5 women and 3 men of the jury that their job was not to find someone to blame, merely to reach one of several available verdicts. The first witness was Dr. Hugh White, a pathologist from Southmead Hospital, who had examined Kathleen Warbutton's body. He said the cause of death was bronchopneumonia due to starvation and neglect.
54-year-old Kathleen Warbutton had always been small, at just over 5 feet tall. She weighed just 3 stone 13 pounds when she died at her flat in Southmead, where she lived with her husband and son. Statements from police officers who went there were read out. They said her body was emaciated, lying on a filthy sofa. Detective Sergeant David Jones at the front told the court she had a long history of mental disorders, and he said she had little contact with her husband, who spent most of his time away from home after starting an affair. A total of 24 witnesses will give evidence. 2 of her sisters, seen on the right, will be allowed to join numerous lawyers in asking questions. The inquest is expected to last several days. Paul Bartrop, BBC News West, Bristol.
Well, still to come, Christmas Day 1994, weighing less than 4 stone.
Keith Warbutton was Kathleen's second husband. Her previous marriage ended in divorce after 10 years. She married Keith in 1975, and 2 years later they had a son, Matthew. All three lived at the house in Southmead, where she was later to die. But her mental health worsened. She smoked and drank heavily and suffered a stroke. The court heard that Kathleen Warbutton was badly affected when in late 1993 she discovered her husband had started a relationship with a woman at work, and she'd contacted her doctor. Dr. Andrew Green was Mrs. Warbutton's GP for nearly 2 years until he left the practice 3 months before she died. He said she had a very dependent personality and had fallen to pieces when she found out her husband was having an affair. He'd given her tranquilizers and had referred her to the community psychiatric team, but in a letter to them, he'd warned that she'd talked of killing her husband. 3 months later, he'd got her admitted to Southmead Hospital. 7 days after that, she discharged herself. He later left the Monks Park practice in Southmead, where she was registered, and several different doctors then dealt with her. One locum GP today testified that she appeared to be deliberately restricting the amount she ate and drank, but refused all offers of help. Dr. Stuart Noakes, seen here on the right, saw her at the end of October. He said Keith Warbutton appeared to be at his wit's end with his wife and requested that her own GP visit soon. That was Dr. Michael Dennison, seen here wearing glasses, but he didn't visit Kathleen.
From News West, good evening. An inquest into the death of the Bristol woman Kathleen Warbutton, who died weighing less than 4 stone, has decided that she died of self-neglect. But the verdict has angered her sisters, who claim the authorities failed to take proper action to save her from starvation.
This was the room where Kathleen Warbutton wasted away. Today it's clean and well decorated, but on Christmas Day in 1994 it looked very different. Police who went to the flat that Sunday morning found her thin, emaciated body lying in a filthy duvet on the sofa, with the debris of cigarettes and pill bottles scattered around. Kathleen's husband, Keith, arrived at the final day of the inquest, convinced he couldn't have saved his wife from her tragic end. He gave evidence that he had always left his wife's sandwiches, but they must have been eaten by the dog.
I haven't got no guilty feelings at all. Not at all. I'd done the best I could for Kathleen, and I did love her. And I still do.
In the years before her death, she was under the care of doctors at the Monks Park surgery in Southmead. She had a stroke which had left her partially paralysed. She frequently used tranquilizers and had several spells in hospital for psychiatric treatment. The inquest heard how she hadn't eaten for the last 8 weeks of her life and had repeatedly refused offers of help from nurses and social workers.
After 3 hours, the jury returned a verdict that Mrs. Warbutton had died of natural causes, brought about by self-neglect, due to starvation. A finding which brought an angry reaction from her sisters.
We struggled against powerful barristers trying to get to the truth. We had no representation to fight for the victim in this case. What we did was not good enough. We are saddened that the system failed her.
Police officers who investigated the death were praised by the coroner, but they too were disappointed.
The adjudication was made by the coroner within the framework of the rules of the coroner's court. But from a personal point of view, I do question in this day and age how a lady could be allowed to die in these unfortunate set of circumstances.
But the verdict was welcomed by the health services.
Obviously, we're delighted that the jury received a verdict on this occasion, and we'd like to echo the coroner's closing remarks, particularly in relation to hoping that the family will now find peace.
Mrs. Warbutton's sisters say they'll be taking the case up with the General Medical Council. Steve Brodie, BBC News West, Bristol.
Another criminal today decided that Kathleen Warbutton, the Bristol woman who neglect. Bob Constantine reports.
Keith Warbutton left the inquest this afternoon, relieved that it was finally over and that he'd been cleared of any blame for his wife's death.
Yeah, my conscience is clear. I know that one day I'll see Kath again, because he's just around the corner, and I met him for that corner. And when I leave this earth, then I know I'll be bumping into Kath again.
The jury decided that Kathleen Warbutton, who weighed just 3 stone 13 pounds, died through self-neglect. She'd wasted away at her home in Bristol, lying on a sofa and refusing food for 8 weeks before her death on Christmas Day in 1994.